Okay, in this presentation I want to flesh out a little of what the text says about nuclear proliferation. I'm going to cover some of what's in the text and add a little bit more to it. First of all, there are a bunch of nuclear control measures out there, and I'm not going to test you on this, not going to test you on anything about these in particular, but I want you to be aware that there's a lot out there. For instance, there's the International Agency, the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, which is a UN organization that has a global safeguard system. They have monitoring of nuclear technology for participants to verify that what they're doing is for peaceful, generally either scientific. There's a lot of nuclear medicine, but by and large it's nuclear power generation. And so these are the guys who go around the world and monitor how much uranium you've got, where you've got it, are you using it. They do inspections, and this is a great example of an international organization that helps everyone to understand that other people aren't cheating. And it's a good example from the neoliberal institutionalist point of view of an institution that helps mitigate anarchy. They don't enforce anything, they just observe and report. They're like mall cops. But the fact that they're there makes people comfortable that nations with developed nuclear energy programs are not diverting those resources to other nefarious or security-oriented purposes. There's a comprehensive test ban treaty, the CTBT, that has basically outlawed a lot of testing as a way to kind of rein in the system. And in a lot of ways that treaty was picked. One reason you ban tests is it's easy to monitor tests. It's hard to cheat. You set off a nuke, people are going to know about it just through the seismic activity. And so that was a treaty. There's a case of a treaty being created where something is inherently easy to observe, and so they could be sure that people were reneging on the deal if they did. There are nuclear weapons free zones in the world. There's actually a lot of the world is a nuclear weapons free zone. The UN, this is another UN project where the signatories to it will they go through a certain process, but they declare an area nuclear weapons free. That means you're not allowed to have them, you're not allowed to let them be based there, and they just say, we aren't going to have any of that. Latin America, everything south of the Rio Grande basically is a nuclear weapon free zone. Africa, the Southeast Asia, Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, all the way through to Australia, that's supposed to be a nuclear weapons free zone. Antarctica is also one, as is outer space. You're not allowed to deploy weapons. They can pass through, presumably on the way to a target, but you aren't allowed to post things in space. So there are a lot of areas in the world that are nuclear weapons free zones. Then there's a couple things. There's a regime on controlling missile technology. There's a Hague Code of Conduct regarding weapons. There's the Nuclear Suppliers Group is amongst the people that produce technology that can be used in nuclear weapons research. Much of it peaceful. After India popped off a nuke in 1970, it was, oh my God, people can use this stuff for other purposes, and so they created a system of controls on the materials that can be used for it. And of course there's the granddaddy of them all, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or the NPT, which blessedly drops an N out of it, so we can just call it the NPT. That was set up in 1970, and there are 189 signatories to it. I think that's the correct number. Key thing, there are only 4 nations that are members of the UN that haven't signed on. They are India, Israel, Pakistan, and South Sudan. Now, South Sudan, that's interesting. Why would they, they aren't close to having a nuke. India, Israel, and Pakistan, though, clearly they do have nukes. India and Pakistan make no secret about it. Israel, on the other hand, worst kept secret in the world, that in Israel they deny they have them, but they do. or they neither confirmed nor denied. But everyone's pretty convinced that they have them, and they actually have weapons stockpiled that they can use. This treaty was set up to try to prevent nuclear weapons from getting out of the club of people who already had them. Critics of it, and by critics of it, well, realists think is ridiculous. We'll get into Waltz in a second. The people who believe in treaties, though, and think that they're potentially useful, they are critical of this because the treaty envisioned the nuclear powers eventually getting out, giving up their nuclear weapons. And there's been very little movement in that direction by the nuclear powers. And so one of the arguments is, hey, one of the key discussions here purposes here was to get this, to move in that direction. And nuclear powers have not moved in that direction, so the fact that other people who might be signatories to it are less enthralled with the treaty is perhaps understandable. And that's one of the key criticisms of what's been done or not been done with the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Okay, so those are just a quick overview of a bunch of different things. If you want to know more about these, pretty much, you just let me Google that for you. But you can find a lot of information on that online. Okay, with regard to realist views, your textbook talks about the Waltz-Sagan debate, and I think that's a good one. And Ken Waltz, father of neorealism, his view is that the slow spread of nuclear weapons around the world is eventually stabilizing, and he thinks that a slow spread of them is better than a rapid spread, because rapid spreads can freak people out by rapidly unbalancing power between nations. Because in his view, a nuke is power, and nations, seek greater power to provide their security. And Waltz's view of this, like realists in general, is it's just business. It's just the business of security. And there's nothing nefarious in it. Everyone's got to seek their security. And in securing your military security, a nuclear weapon is probably a really good thing to have on hand. And so he feels that a rapid spread would be scary and destabilizing, at least in the short term. But no spread of them would not be conducive either, because nations that don't have them would be really worried about the nations that do. So Waltz really feels that the expansion of or proliferation of nukes, as long as it's at a foreseeable pace or a slow pace, is good. He argues that when a state gets a nuclear weapon and becomes a new nuclear state, they're actually going to become constrained by the responsibility they will inherit. It will cause them to develop a sense of responsibility. Now what they do matters in a way it didn't matter before. And so he sees this as being moving them up into a higher level in the system is going to make them more responsible, and it's going to also force them to use greater caution. What they do matters now, so they have to be careful about not causing ripples in the pond that maybe they didn't have to worry about before. A nation that doesn't have nukes can have a aggressive foreign policy. It can have it can make statements that are very over the top. It can espouse revolutionary goals, and no one cares. This is how they're acting up. Once you have nukes, well, now people are going to care, and so you're going to have to tread lightly, right? That big stick is going to make you have to walk soft, and he sees this as being a natural process and something that would be good. He also argues that the likelihood of war decreases as deterrent capabilities increase, and therefore having nukes, as long as you're responsible, and he thinks that nations are going to be responsible because they're going to be forced into that position by their role in the international system, that having nukes is going to make wars harder to start, right? Because you've got a big deterrent, it's going to deter people from doing things, and it's going to make you feel better that, yeah, I can stop them. If something bad happens, I can stop it. And so it's going to, increase security and stability in the world. This is the Waltz, and again, Waltz/neo-realist point of view. Counter to this, we have Scott Sagan, not Carl Sagan, who did the first Cosmos, and we now have a new one going on, so you might have heard of him mentioned in one of those episodes. This is Scott Sagan, a political scientist, believes at Stanford, and he is going to take, in broad terms, a liberal approach, because Sagan pulls the state apart. He looks inside the state to see what's going on, and what he sees going on in the state doesn't encourage him. He argues that, first, with regard to militaries that are going to control these things, right? He says, look, the organizational characteristics of professional militaries produce behaviors in them that are likely to lead to deterrence failure and deliberate or accidental war. What types of behaviors he's talking about? In his view, the militaries have generally, and this is a common view, that militaries tend to be offensive in nature. They like to strike first. They worry about losing capacities. They worry about preserving their force. And so the general view here is that militaries will tend to be more aggressive in their desire to use nuclear weapons. They will be more risk averse in terms of worrying about, what will happen if we're attacked. Will we lose the ability to use the nukes? They're also likely to be very focused on an enemy's capabilities rather than their intentions. Militaries plan against what the other guy can do. They tend to employ worst case scenarios in their planning, and as a result, they're likely to have a intentionally biased. If you plan for the worst case, well, you're biasing your planning, and therefore he says that they're more likely to make mistakes. They're more prone to the use, either deliberate or accidentally, of nuclear weapons in war, and they may accidentally provoke wars. Now, as far as the state is concerned, Sagan notes that many states are either run by militaries or have weak civilian control, and sometimes the militaries participate in the government. Very often foreign or defense ministries, or usually states have ministries. In the United States we have departments, and secretaries or other nations have ministries and ministers. Very often defense ministers are not civilians, they are uniformed military people. And very often governments depend on their military in a political way, so that the military has, especially authoritarian regimes, tend to depend on their military for support. Therefore, the military, the civilians have very weak control on the military, and it runs two ways. One, the military can influence policy making, their foreign policy making. Decisions to go to war can be influenced by the military. And also the civilians have less control on how the military works. And so they're less likely to monitor whatever system the military has for controlling its nukes and using them. The civilians are not going to be in a position to monitor it. Questions will not be asked. In the United States, when we accidentally fly an airplane with 4 nukes to have the oil changed at another base, or, well, not the oil change, but to have maintenance done, and, oh, wow, look at that, you got 4 nukes on board. Questions are asked, and you're going to end up in front of Congress explaining this one. When all your officers cheat on, or not all of them, when a bunch of your officers cheat on their test on how to run their nuclear weapons, their intercontinental ballistic missile silos, Congress is going to ask questions, and you're going to have some scrutiny from the civilian side that probably won't happen in a lot of other nations around the world. And therefore, Sagan is really worried that these nations are not going to be responsible in the way that, well, maybe they'll be responsible in some of the ways that Waltz is talking about, but he questions that and adds new ways that they can screw up, basically. And this is, and a lot of Sagan's research as he focuses on the errors the United States makes. He says, look, this is a best case scenario, and the United States has made all these different errors. What do you think these other nations are going to do? So his counter argument, again, we're taking more of a liberal approach in the sense that we're looking inside the state, whereas the realists don't. The realists look outside the state to the international system. And Sagan is making this counter argument that no, it's not good for these things to proliferate because it just increases the odds of accidental warfare. Also, it may be even deliberate warfare. Now, moving from these guys, from that debate, which your book talks about, and hopefully that just fleshed it out a bit, research by Singh and Way in 2004, these are two political scientists, they looked at the question of nuclear proliferation, right? This is a dependent variable. They're trying to explain when it occurs. When will states get nuclear weapons? And, like all good empirical researchers in political science, what they do is they get the theoretical literature, all the ideas people have about cause and effect relationships, all the ideas out there about how when states are more likely, or what drives them to get nukes, and they bring these ideas together and they said, look, there's basically three lines of argument here. One, there's some folks that talk about technological determinants, and that basically they say the proliferation, the acquiring of a nuclear weapon is driven by your ability to make one. Yeah, that's sensible. And this is largely, things that indicate this can be the level of economic development in the society, the technological skills, the science ability. They have a lot of different things that can indicate where someone is on that path. Then there's external determinants. Waltz is key here. People talk about what in the international system outside the state will encourage it to get a nuclear weapon. And then there are the internal determinants, and Sagan falls into this category. People looking at what's going on within the state that will encourage them to get nuclear weapons. And I'm not going to go into the particulars because there's a long list of different things that are pointed out. But and this is typical of how researchers work. They get all these ideas. They then get a data set of nations, and Singh and Way get all nations. And over time, and they look at it and they say, all right, what level of economic development do people seem to get the nukes, right? And so we can look at nations over time and we can see no nuke, no nuke, no nuke. Oh, hey, a nuke. And they can look at what levels of scientific development, what levels of economic development are associated with that, and they can find trends in this data by using statistics. And they get all the, from everybody, they try to find indicators, pieces of information that represent, the level of external threat, level of democracy, these various things that people have identified. And so, kind of avoiding getting into detail of that, let's look at their results. In general, they find that, most people know what they're talking about, that most of the things that people talk about are in some way significant, meaning that there is an association between what they identify as the cause of proliferation and whether proliferation occurs or not in reality. However, in looking at all the information, their analysis showed that two variables were the most influential, the biggest factors. One, the threat, right? And they had a measure for how threatened a nation was. And they also had a measure for economic development. They said these two threats, these two variables, called independent variables technically, are most associated, they're most influential in predicting whether or not a nation will actually proliferate. And so these are the two big factors. And they argue that in general, realism here is supported, that the view that, hey, international threat drives behavior. Because you can look at it and say, well, threat is the motivation and economic development is the ability. right? And so, yes, you have to have a certain level of economic development. This is something we call a necessary condition. You can't do it without it, but you don't necessarily do it. What provides what we call sufficiency is having a threat. And the argument here is, look, if you have the capability and you're threatened, guess what? You get a nuke. Probably not that startling, but with all the different other alternative explanations, this is how you sort out. You look at the data, see which ones hold the most water. Based on this, though, Singh and Way raised the question, is it wise to go around threatening states that appear to be on the cusp of getting a nuclear weapon? Is it really wise to add to the threat level if threat is what's driving them? And the alternative is, why don't you address their safety concerns, their security concerns rather? Why don't you try to make them feel less threatened? And then, our data suggests that states that aren't threatened but have the technological capacity nevertheless don't do it, right? And so this is, one of their arguments is that based on this research, this seems to be the thing. And now, in all research, you have to keep in mind, we're talking about trends. We're talking about what is more likely to happen. And therefore, there are counterexamples. And in life, there are counterexamples at all times. And you use statistical research to figure out to sort those out. To look at a large number of cases, all of them, ideally, and figure out what causes are associated most closely with what effects, and then you have an idea of how you should act in general. And so there are always going to be counterexamples out there, but they're by getting down to these two things, they do pose a very interesting question. If your knee-jerk approach is to threaten people who are developing nukes, you may be making the situation worse. Now, Rauchhaus here, and he's kind of the last one I'm going to look at, also does empirical work, looking at the question of what effect do nukes have on the world. And so now the dependent variable is not whether or not you get nukes. The dependent variable is whether or not you have a war or a lower level of violence or some type of crisis. Okay? So we have three things that can occur. We have major wars, where you go and both sides use force and they fight. And I believe they're using the definition of 1,000 deaths. Then you have lower level, limited uses of force, which can mean one nation using force on the other, or you can have a one-sided use of force, or you can have a small mutual use of force that doesn't reach a certain casualty level. I'm pretty sure he used the 1,000 casualty mark there. So you have three things that can happen, and here the independent variable is, do the states have nuclear weapons or not? And generally, when researchers look at these types of problems, what they want to do is, and what he does here is, you get all the nations in the world, and you're trying to understand, when are they going to fight, when are they not going to fight. What you don't do is look at cases where there was a war and say, oh, look, this war occurred and neither side had nukes, or this war occurred and both had nukes. That's selection bias. You're just looking at one outcome and trying to understand it. And that outcome is what you're trying to produce. If you're trying to understand, or what you're trying to predict, if you're trying to understand when war occurs, well, you're also trying to understand when war doesn't occur. And you need cases of both. This is what's called variation in the dependent variable, the thing you're trying to explain. And so if you want to show when a war occurs, you've got to show the cases in which it won't. And if you want to test hypotheses about when war is more or less likely to occur, you need to have a data set that doesn't just include wars, it includes not wars. Problem with that is, well, what's not a war? It's not an event. And arguably, every time the United States doesn't go to war with Canada every year, we had not war, right? And if you take that logic and apply it across the world, what you see that you have to do is you have to take all the nations and create what are called dyads, right? Make them into pairs. And so every year, you look at the United States, didn't go to war this year. Okay, so that means we didn't go to war with Canada, we didn't go to war with Mexico, we didn't go to war with Jamaica, we didn't go to war with Great Britain, through the list. And there's 190 some odd nations on this list, right? Take 109, whatever the number is, let's say it's 194. Take 194, square it, that's the number of dyads you have in any year. Then you take a data set over, 50 years. Well, you got 50 times that. So you end up with a lot of observations in this thing. And for each observation, though, each dyad, each pairing of nation, you say, all right, here's the nation. Did they go to war? Did they have a crisis? Did they have a other lower level use of force? Or nothing? And you also say, did they have nukes? Did they not have nukes? You might also throw in some control variables in there. Are they contiguous? Do they border one another? Or how far apart? There are other things you can throw in there to control for it. By the way, nations that share a border go to war more often than nations that don't. Go figure. Nations that are far apart from one another tend to not go to war against one another. So it's really not any surprise that Botswana and Peru have not gotten into a war. You control for that with a good researcher controls for that. But what Rauchhaus is able to do is now test some of these ideas about what the effects of nuclear weapons are. And these are hypotheses, right? Your hypothesis here is you have a theory and you say, all right, based on this theory of how nations work, this is what we should see in a particular situation. That's what a hypothesis is. And so the first hypothesis tested is that the probability of major war between two states will decrease if both states possess nuclear weapons. Makes sense, right? This is the basic realist idea, that they both have a deterrent, they will deter each other from fighting, and we won't see war. And so Rauchhaus tested this and confirmed. His data supported it. You don't see as many major wars between two states that are nuclear. Right? Because he's got this data set with all the states and all the wars, and his computer figures this stuff out for you. It's brilliant. The second hypothesis, right? Now this is an interesting one. This is part of what's called this paradox. You see the stability-instability paradox. That the paradox is predicted to be, this is theoretical, that states won't get into big wars with one another if they both have nuclear weapons. However, they're still going to have problems with one another. And in fact, because they have nuclear weapons, they may be more quick on the draw. They may be more worried about each other. Because, well, yeah, I'm worried about what China does because China's got nukes. Right? Vietnam, no nukes, not so worried about them. And so this might exacerbate tensions between them. However, they're deterred from going to war, big time. So we're going to have more crises and more lower level uses of force amongst this crowd. And so the probability of crisis initiation and limited uses of force between two states will increase when both states possess nuclear weapons. That's hypothesis 2. Confirmed. Rauchhaus says, yes, we do see this in the data. So, okay, these two hypotheses are confirmed, and we have our cute little stability-instability paradox. A complexity in the world, right? Things are not simple. Paradoxes, we like paradoxes because they are complex and interesting. The last two, though, refer to what happens when one side has nukes and the other side doesn't. So, the first hypothesis here is that the probability of major war between two states will decrease or remain constant if one state possesses nuclear weapons. Not confirmed. In the data, there are changes. Now, of course, this we would suggest that, well, what you see is we don't have the opposite, right? It's not the data. The result finds that, well, we don't see an increase, but we also, we don't see a decrease. here in this probability. So it looks like having one-sided possession of nuclear weapons doesn't really stop major wars from occurring. That's interesting. Wars are just as likely to occur, and maybe more likely to occur, if one state possesses nuclear weapons. Hypothesis 4 deals with lower level conflicts, right? And the idea here is, well, lower level conflicts will decrease or remain the same if one state possesses nuclear weapons. And it turns out, no, this is not the case. In fact, the opposite occurs. When one state has a nuclear weapon and the other state doesn't, we see an increase in lower level conflicts. Now, why might that be? Well, it might be because one state has nukes, the other doesn't. The other state not really so worried about it's not necessarily going to go to war more often, right? However, at a low level, it's like, it's going to be a long time before you bring that nuke out. And one argument is, because you have nukes, we are more worried about you. And so we are going to get into lower levels of conflict. We're going to have tensions. And you having a nuke doesn't solve that. So this is the stability-instability paradox. Yes, if two states have nuclear weapons, we're not likely to see major wars between them. However, when both states or even one state has a nuclear weapon, these lower levels of crisis and lower levels of conflict are still likely to occur. And when one state has a nuke, it doesn't necessarily decrease the probability of a major war. So without that mutual deterrence, we're not necessarily seeing these things as being stabilizing. So this is an interesting result because it confirms part of what the realists are talking about, but exposes a paradox, something you wouldn't expect to be the case. And this is, we like these things again because we think the world is complex. We like complex results. We like to find things that are obvious and we're pretty sure are the case. We'd like to see them confirmed by analysis, and then new wrinkles, something we call counterintuitive results, right, that run counter to our intuition. In other words, something surprising come out of the data, and that's what we have here. So there you go, a little bit more graduate level stuff, but it kind of shows that there perhaps should be a little bit of concern about proliferation, that it isn't all sunny, even though it does seem in many cases to have an effect in terms of stopping major wars. Okay, so that's what I got for you here. Got it done in 33 minutes. Again, anything you're going to be tested on, and I guarantee I'm going to test you on nuclear non-proliferation, but mainly we're going to go with the textbook and probably going to be that Waltz Sagan thing.